Okay, well, I'll go ahead and just go through a little bit of housekeeping. Thank you all for being here. I'm very, very happy that you're joining us tonight for such a really needed topic. I think we had a great response to this topic, so very, very glad that you're all here. So we've got some great speakers tonight with you, and so this program is being recorded, but we're going to stop recording when we get to the portion of the Q&A. At the end of the Q&A session, one of our guests tonight, Ken Belden, is going to take us through a guided meditation. We will start recording at that point because we do want to make sure that we capture that for anyone who's not able to join us live this evening. The follow-up page for this program is conversation.zone/families. And so tonight's presenters are amazing. Patrick Dowling and Ken Belden are with us. You're also going to hear from Chris, who is a dear friend to this organization, and she's a family member who's going to share her personal story as well. And that's all that I have. So I'm going to tell you about our first speaker, who is Patrick Dowling. Patrick is a licensed professional counselor who utilizes various models of therapy, including family systems, motivational interviewing, dialectical behavior therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, MBSR, which is mindfulness-based stress reduction, trauma treatment, and relapse prevention. Patrick has been especially known for his successful assistance with families in complex interventions. So Patrick, floor is yours. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Kim, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this program tonight. Much needed, obviously. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I think about approaching trauma and/or families that have been affected by trauma. So I'm just going to kind of pop my head open and kind of share, be careful what it looks like in there. So here are a couple things I just want to kind of define trauma a little bit more succinctly. So when we talk about trauma, there's generally kind of three kinds of trauma that we experience. The first is, in trauma in general, I really think about, for me, I think about trauma is when our ability to create and maintain safety is overwhelmed. That's when we become traumatized. We get overwhelmed by an experience. And those experiences kind of fall into three categories. And the first is acute trauma. Acute trauma is more of a singular event. It's a salient event. So that's more of a one-off type event. It could be a car accident. It could be a natural disaster of some kind. It could be, something, unwelcome in your life that overwhelms your ability to create safety. The next way that I think about trauma is chronic trauma. And chronic trauma is a repeated and prolonged exposure to something that overwhelms your ability to make yourself safe. So some of those are some type of domestic violence or some kind of chronic recurrent abuse. And chronic trauma can be highly, highly damaging because it really diminishes that person's ability to feel like they can make themselves safe and or create safety for themselves and or their family. So there's acute trauma, there's chronic trauma, and then there's complex trauma, which is exposure to varied and multiple traumatic events, often of an invasive and or interpersonal nature. So things like the ACE survey speak to complex trauma, where people have multiple risk factors. The Adverse Childhood Experience survey that is becoming more and more prominent in treatment centers, understanding not just how did you become addicted, but kind of how did we get here? What happened to you, right? Not what did you do? What happened to you? So when we talk about trauma, I kind of think about it in those three veins. Obviously, none of those are mutually exclusive, but I think it helps inform how that impacts a person. So I do want to, I'm going to, if I might, I'm going to read a couple of things. They're rather brief. I think they're really important. And I just want to kind of talk about addiction for a minute in general. And I'm going to read to you from a book. It's not a bedtime story. This is from A Drunking Problem. Really great book. I love this book by Richard Crody. You can tell I'm all geeked out. I got tons of sticky notes on this book. So this is a gentleman who was the head of Shepherd Pratt's Drug and Alcohol Treatment Center, and he wrote a book called A Drunking Problem. I'm just going to read two paragraphs which I think kind of set a context for addiction. A lot of us are very familiar, but I think these are helpful. So I'm going to just take a couple minutes and read these. The first is about projection. Projection is that trick of mind by which an individual sees in others what he is unhappy with and rejects in himself. It also impacts personality. If I believe that drinking is an angry activity in our society, when it is really my own angry drinking, which is unacceptable to me, that projection will affect me in far-reaching ways. I may end up constructing a philosophy which claims the world to be an angry place, all the while believing that my thoughts are based on truths, quote, out there, when actually their source is in me. And if the world becomes an angry place, I just lost my place. And if the world becomes an angry place, it becomes a frightening place too. The denial, rationalizations, distortions, manipulations, and exaggerations needed to sustain even an ordinary addiction, if given enough time to work on a personality, are capable of creating the character disorders described in the DSM. One need not have a personality disorder at the start of alcoholism to end up with one. So I think what he's saying here is just kind of laying the groundwork for the fact that addiction has such far-reaching effects on a person's personality, and the need to lie to self, to lie to others, to manipulate. And that's why, like, kind of later in the recovery process, we talk about that the person in recovery or early recovery or an active addiction can no longer differentiate the true from the false, meaning they've gotten so good at lying to themselves and lying to others, they don't know what is true and what's not true anymore. So that creates such a skewed reality, such a skewed context for that person and their family system, that often the family, because the family can become subject to the alcoholic dictates, right, become a slave by surrogate to alcoholism or drug addiction, that the least healthy person in the family system has the most power, right? And that's when people start walking on eggshells, afraid to tell the truth, afraid to have hard conversations, afraid to create safety. So I just want to talk about that creates a context where the family system is really compromised and or not trusting themselves. So the second paragraph I want to read in this one is called Projection of Self-Mistrust. Addiction is hiding. Even before an alcoholic sneaks a drink, he hides how much he drinks. He hides its consequences. He hides his feelings about it. And he hides the effect it has at home. If others were to see his pain and shame, his loneliness and fear, even he would have to admit that something is wrong. So he hides his feelings. When asked how he feels, he says he is fine, even though at that very moment he may be entertaining suicidal thoughts. What you see is not who he is. And such duplicity, a calm exterior hiding a turbulent soul, persuades the alcoholic that he is fake, a phony. If then he projects this onto others, he begins believing that everyone fakes it, that no one can be trusted. When addicts hide behind smiles, they find it difficult not to believe that all smiles are masks and all caring pretense. They learn mistrust. So I think Richard Purdy does a really great job of kind of defining the context of how addiction affects people and their ability to trust themselves, to trust others, and this kind of default setting of walking around not trusting others because you're not trusting yourself. So what that means is, even when people are trying to be helpful, trying to be supportive, those persons are viewed with distrust. Because that person fundamentally distrusts their own judgment and projects that onto others. I want to talk a little bit real quickly about a vastly underutilized resource in recovery. I perceive the 9th step in 12-step recovery as a tremendously underutilized resource. So the 9th step is when we go to people that we've caused harm to and make amends. When I do interventions, I have family members make amends in the intervention. And they say things to the person like, Jimmy, I am so sorry that it took us this long to understand addiction and what was going on, and that we co-signed and allowed this stuff to go on. That was our mistake. And I'm not going to make that mistake anymore. and my enabling, avoidance, whatever has caused harm, and I'm going to take a full responsibility for the creation and maintenance of safety. And the alcoholic thinks, yay, you were wrong. And then they hear the part where we're not going to do that anymore. He's like, oh, darn. So it's a renegotiation of the maintenance of safety. I think this is radically underutilized by family members of an alcoholic or an addict. I think it's also radically underutilized by people in recovery. I can't tell you how many people I've worked with who are long-term sober and have not done what I would call a proper ninth step with their family system in terms of reconciling how specifically they've caused their addiction and they have caused harm, which is a touch point and an opportunity to reclaim or recover safety, right? The big book says this: the alcoholic is like a tornado roaring his way through the lives of others. Hearts are broken, sweet relationships are dead, affections have been uprooted, selfish and inconsiderate habits have kept the home in turmoil. We feel a man is unthinking when he says that sobriety is enough. He's like the farmer who came up out of his cyclone cellar to find his home ruined. To his wife, he remarked, "Don't see anything the matter here, Ma. Ain't it grand the wind stopped blowing?" Yes, there is a long period of reconstruction ahead. I'm going to repeat that one. Yes, there's a long period of reconstruction ahead. And this is really cool. So this is what it says to the alcoholic, but I think it's also can be true for the family member. We must take the lead. So what's really interesting is the responsible party is the person who takes responsibility. That's how this works, right? And everybody kind of waits for someone else to take responsibility for the creation of safety. And I always say, the cavalry isn't coming. You are the cavalry. You need to take a full responsibility for creating safety for yourself and your family. That can be the alcoholic or addict. That can be the family member. Somebody has to be the person who steps up and starts renegotiating these relationships and stop being subject to the alcoholic or addicted whims. So we must take the lead. Our remorseful mumbling that we are sorry won't fit the bill at all. We ought to sit down. This is huge. So many people don't do this, and it leaves tremendous scars in the family that are unresolved. We ought to sit down with the family and frankly analyze the past as we now see it, being very careful not to criticize. Their defects may be glaring, but the chances are that our own actions are partly responsible. So we clean house with the family, asking each morning in meditation that our Creator show us the way of patience, tolerance, kindliness, and love. So what does that mean? That means to me, on the other end of an addicted crisis, that we sit down with the family and consciously recover safety, recover the ability to take care of ourselves individually, to recover the ability to take care of each other. One of the tenets that I offer in family therapy is we need to be able to honor all of our agreements at the same time. Addiction and/or some mental illnesses create this false dilemma that says you can either choose between loving me or allowing my behavior, right? You can't do both. You either have to love me the way I am, addiction, mental illness, and all, and the dysregulated behavior, or you don't love me, aka you're a bad person, right? That's a false dilemma. A healthy agreement is that all parties get to honor themselves and their relationships at the same time. So what that means in my mind is that we have to be able to honor myself, my primary relationships, my immediate family relationships, my relationships with my social supports, with work, with hobbies, interests, fun, with the ability to play, that an individual needs to be able to honor all of those. And whatever has compromised the ability to thrive and be well needs to be addressed. Very often what I see happen is because we're so desperate for someone to get sober and stop drinking or stop drugging or whatever the case may be, what happens is we settle for the absence of chaos instead of thriving. And that's what I would call bargaining, is we settle and say, hey, at least they're not blah, blah, blah. At least they're not drinking. At least they're not drugging. But what that leaves on the table is the opportunity for a family to truly heal and for everybody to really have their voice and talk about what they need, communicate what they need, expect that a family system is going to be responsive to what other people need, inclusive of holding the pain and holding the hurt that addiction has caused other people. So that brings to mind this, I always think about mental health real true mental health as the ability to hold two seemingly disparate perspectives at the same time. I love you and I don't like you right now. I want to be healthy and I want to eat potato chips. I want my person to be sober and I want to create safety for myself and be able to ask for what I need, right? So I can rock the boat a little bit. I can push and ask for what I need. Is I need to be able to do both of those things at the same time, because what I just talked about is we need to honor a lot of things. And I always say in sobriety, we just have to be good at like 10 things, right? Which is a lot. That's called life. So there's this intersection of resilience, trust and safety versus enabling addiction / avoidance of conflict and discomfort. There's self-care versus availability to others. There's love versus healthy boundaries. So I think part of this real recovery or real healing process for a family system is being able to hold both. And I sit with people several people today, sitting with recovering the ability to trust themselves and listen to themselves. And yet they're afraid that if they ask their loved one to participate in a meaningful, thoughtful way, that maybe they won't be able to do that. So that person sometimes gets excused. And they kind of write an excuse notes. They don't ask the hard question. They don't have the difficult conversation because maybe they're afraid that that person won't be able to show up in that way. And maybe they won't, but I think if we don't ask the question, then they won't, right? So I think of real, family healing as that the individuals and the family system recovering the ability to become fully functional, to have uncomfortable conversations, to be kind, to be loving, to be mutually considerate, to play, to have fun, to be spontaneous, to be thoughtful, to do, kind of do all the things. And I think when we unconsciously write excuse notes for ourselves or other people, we handicap that system and that system's ability to do what we would hope it would do. So part of how do we kind of recover that, right? So there's multiple ways to get back to that. Individual counseling, family counseling, grief and loss groups, parent partnership, Al-Anon, EMDR, psychodrama, also finding purpose. A lot of the folks on this call already do this very specifically, is transforming suffering into healing and growth. I know part of the reason that I do the work that I do is because I've seen how my injuries, how my traumas have informed and or sensitized my ability to be more helpful to other people. So I want to talk, and I know I'm pushing on time, but I just want to bring up 4 questions that I think about a lot. And I imagine a lot of the family members think about a lot. The first one is, how can I be well / thrive while my loved one is unwell? How can I do that? Is that allowed? Is my okay to do that? Am I allowed to be happy? And I think about the conflict, the push and pull between guilt versus radical ownership of what is mine and not owning what is not mine. And I think false pride or taking ownership of something that isn't mine can be a huge trap. I think it's a huge rabbit hole, and I think we have to be really careful. And I have seen parents specifically do an amazing job of taking radical ownership of how they participate. And despite the fact that their loved one isn't self-correcting or getting sober, be able to put their head on their pillow at night, knowing that they're doing everything they can to be helpful. That's a really scary thing. We can talk about that a little later on, how fear can become a hostage crisis, that we're afraid to ask people to step into their recovery because we're afraid of what might happen via suicidality or an overdose or some type of behavior that then ends up holding that family system hostage. The second question I think about is, and a lot of families come up against this question, could I have done something different? I think that's normal. Of course, people think that. I think we all Monday morning quarterback ourselves. I think it's helpful to understand that addiction is, 1, bigger than any singular person. 2, not fair. Fair has left the building a long time ago when addiction's in the mix. 3, very complex in terms of how to treat it effectively, especially because of the intersection of mental health and substance use issues. and what's helpful, what's enabling, what's not. So I think a lot of people struggle with that. I think it's important to be able to talk about that and hash that out with somebody who has a little more objectivity and also is caring. 3, how do I/we move forward, AKA recover the ability to trust myself, my judgment, and my relationships. 4, how do I be kind and loving to myself? So these are just 4 of the questions that come up for me. And I just want to share just anecdotally. So I had a client I worked with 5-6 years ago, and I worked with this family through the pre-intervention process, through intervention, and then ongoing family counseling. And they did a really wonderful job, got involved in the parent groups, did tons of work, involved in the treatment centers, family program, just A+, did all the things. And what was really interesting is this person of concern, the person who was in and out of treatment, his sister was a nursing student, delightful kid, just wonderful. And it wasn't until this young man was a year sober that it was safe enough for her to have a quote breakdown and talk about the anxiety and the depression that she'd been carrying for years, worried that her brother was going to die, and all the in and out of treatment and detoxes, and so concerned about her parents, and holding all this emotional stuff and having to be the quote responsible kid in the family system. And it was really wonderful that the family system was able to just really scoop her up, support her, help her get the help that she needed, and really just did a wonderful job. And I think because they were plugged in, and I kind of didn't see it coming, and I think I kind of beat myself up a little bit, like, should I have seen that a little more, and the price that it was having on her. And I think probably because this family was in and out of crisis so much, and maybe I even settled for, hey, we got peace here. Maybe wasn't aware of how much she was struggling, because she was part of family sessions too. So, I just want to share that because I think it helps speak to how an addicted crisis affects the other family members, and they become marginalized because you're in crisis, which is very, very hard to avoid, but it's something to kind of put on radar and be aware of. How is this addictive crisis affecting me? How is it affecting my relationships? Making sure that those relationships also don't get marginalized or unnecessarily harmed. I think they're going to be impacted, but how do we protect those families, those family systems, those other members of the family system from harm? So I do want to be careful of time. When Kim asked me to talk about this, I thought, what am I going to say? And then I sat down and wrote 3 pages of notes. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to connecting via the Q&A stuff.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Patrick. There's a lot of really great stuff there. I appreciate that. All right, now we're going to hear from Ken Belden. Ken is a psychotherapist at Revive Wellness, specializing in anxiety, depression, grief, relational challenges and trauma, life transitions, and matters of spirituality and purpose. He's also a person in long-term recovery from a substance use disorder. Ken is an ordained Unitarian Universalist minister and has been a daily mindfulness practitioner, integrating mindfulness into his clinical practice, and has led numerous mindfulness retreats and small groups over the last decade. Ken has a special interest in internal family systems, or IFS, which he's going to, I'm sure, tell you more about. And he provided us with some really great resources that I shared on that follow-up page, conversation.zone/families. So those links are already loaded there. As I mentioned earlier, at the end of this program this evening, the last several minutes, we will, Ken will guide us through a grounding exercise. So definitely stick around for that. And thank you very much for being here, Ken.
Thank you, Kim, for that introduction. And thank you to Kim and Bob for inviting me. Sorry, just give me a notification. There we go. I really want to thank Patrick for, actually in some ways doing so much of the legwork here. Kind of allows me to just not repeat a number of the excellent things that he said. So I'm actually going to start out with a kind of spare functional definition of trauma. Trauma is anything that overwhelms our capacity not just to cope. Trauma is anything that overwhelms our capacity to connect. And by connect, I mean, like Patrick was talking about, with a sense of safety, with a sense that we can be ourselves, with a sense that we can be at ease in our bodies and our minds and our hearts. And so the hope is, it's the hope for all of us, right? That families would give us an experience of that kind of, what we in the biz call a secure attachment, a secure sense of connection. But of course, one of the reasons we're here tonight is that so many of us don't get that. So many of us have traumatic experiences as a result of us being a part of families that very much interrupt our capacity to feel we can connect safely with other people or even safely with ourselves. And so, kind of again, trauma is any event that overwhelms our capacity not just to cope, but to connect with safety. What I want to talk about tonight is some experiences of healing and some approaches to healing within what we call, what is my primary training, internal family systems. It might be a new name to you. It might be something you've heard about. I want to unpack that a little bit because the approach, I think, really does set up some opportunities for people to come into greater awareness with themselves in how their traumatic responses to overwhelming and unsafe experiences have caused certain parts of them to take on roles that are not healthy for them or not healthy for the people around them, and how, in fact, they may end up perpetuating trauma. To unpack what I mean by internal family systems, for those of you not familiar, I'm just going to share a few key terms, one of which is mindfulness. Kim talked about that. I have been a mindfulness practitioner for quite a number of time. I've led mindfulness retreats. I am actually fully retired from a 25-year career / calling, if that's what you want to term it, as a minister. I'm now full-time as a mental health and provider and substance use treatment professional. But as part of my ministry, I did a lot of mindfulness-based work with fellow people in recovery and just in general for folks who are wanting to develop their spiritual lives. But I'm not talking about mindfulness meditation tonight. I'm talking about something much more specific that I think is essential in so many different forms of treatment, and especially with internal family systems. Mindfulness simply means the capacity to pay attention, to notice what's happening within us and around us as it's occurring. So often, this is the very core function of being alive. We all have the capacity for mindfulness. We all have the capacity to pay attention. This is the very thing that's interrupted by trauma, is because what's happening within us, because we're not being able to access or resource a sense of safety, being able to pay attention to what's happening in us or around us is the very first thing that gets interrupted. And so one of the very first things that I will work on with people in my practice is, how do we help you pay attention to what's happening right now? Even if it's 30 seconds, even if it's the smallest dose of mindfulness, 30 seconds, a minute. And if it's not safe to focus on what's inside, that means, hey, especially in this age of telehealth, what does it look like when your cat prances around? We've all seen this, right? Pandemic and post-pandemic. We've all seen when the cat or the dog comes along. Really, what I try to do, bring them into the session. Don't treat them as a hindrance or an interruption. Chances are that pet is around because the person might feel safe with that pet. So I'll start to invite, notice what it's like when you connect with this beloved creature. Notice what your body feels like. And so we're building skills for mindfulness, for paying attention in a trauma-informed way so that it's safe for the person. Over time, these skills build up. I'm going to talk about hearts, which is an essential aspect of internal family systems. And to do that, I'm going to talk very, very briefly about a movie that many of us have seen. I imagine many of you have seen. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands because I can't see all your pictures anyway, but it's the movie Inside Out, if any of you have seen that from Pixar. It is the story of a young girl, 11 years old, who has what is for her a traumatic event. She is kind of taken without her consent. Her family moves to San Francisco from this bucolic life in Wisconsin, where she's safe and she's held and she's connected and she has family and friends. And her parents moved to San Francisco and her dad is working 20 hours a day at Facebook or Google or something like that. And everything around her is unfamiliar. And she starts to retreat and withdraw into herself. And that's actually where most of the movie happens. It's inside her head. It's a Pixar movie. It's great for kids, but it's actually one of the most psychologically insightful movies I've ever seen, because it shows what happens when different parts of her start to have very different approaches to living her life. And it's shown on the outside by her acting out, by her isolating, by her getting very angry. But on the inside, we see a number of core emotions, particularly joy. And who doesn't like joy, right? Joy is a wonderful emotion, a wonderful experience. Except the problem is that joy in this movie becomes a dictator. And joy is at war with sadness. Sadness, you're a bummer. Sadness, I don't want to listen to you. I just want you to get out. And as a result, and we see this all the time in the internal family systems approach, we have what we see as a tug of war, a polarization between parts. And very often what happens in people's lives when these parts of them are in conflict with each other is they will veer from one kind of extreme behavior when they're kind of fully blended with one part, and then as an overcorrection in the opposite direction, blending with another part's emotions. It makes it very hard to have that kind of consistency that fosters safe connection with people. So that's what we mean by parts. We all have them. When we're at peace and normal and feeling balanced, and actually I don't even like that word normal, so strike that I said that, but just feeling balanced within ourselves. It means that we can kind of, negotiate between the parts of us that say, hey, I want to go out for a walk on this beautiful spring night, or I want to stay home and watch Netflix, right? For some people, that's a real big conflict, a real internal conflict between parts of themselves. And we know that these parts can become quite extreme. How we work within internal family systems, or what we call IFS, is to be able to help people listen deeply to what the experiences of these different parts of themselves are and what they are doing, and to do it in a way that feels really safe, so that people are able to, and the best way I can express this is through a visual metaphor. When we're blended, let's say, with a part that really, really wants to drink, or a part that feels very triggered by another person's interaction with us, even if the person didn't intend to cause us harm, when we're blended or kind of fused with the part, it's like the part is right here in front of our eyes. If we were dialoguing right now, I'd ask you, what can I see? Well, and you'd probably say my hands. Because when I'm blended with a part of me, it feels like only that part is real. What we do in IFS is we just want to help get some mindful space and perspective so that that part can still be there. But now I have access to my whole life. I have access to also different parts of who comprises me. So it's like having this perspective of being able to observe, oh, there's a part of me that's really angry right now, or the part of me that's shutting down right now, almost dissociating, and being able to help people unblend from feeling totally hooked by and with a part to being able to notice that part and begin to hear the part's story. This is how people start to establish what is the first step, not the final step, but a consistent step all throughout internal family systems. We say that the most secure attachment we're trying to help people build is the connection between themselves and their parts. We believe in IFS, and for some people, this is a spiritual thing. For some people, it doesn't require spirituality at all. We all have this capacity for deep listening. The metaphor that we use very often, we've all got this inner conductor. And no matter how much trauma we have had in our lives, that inner conductor might be hidden like an eclipse, and it's always there. This is kind of my job as a therapist. I'm not the expert in IFS. No IFS therapist is. What I am is I'm looking for signs that someone is experiencing enough safety to be able to get some space from this with a part, or another part pushing that part out, to just allowing the part to be there. So that, like a conductor, if you've ever been to a symphony, that's what a conductor does, a really wise and skillful one, is listen. Listen for what parts might be a little bit louder. If you can imagine a symphony in which the percussion is just banging away and the strings are like, forget this, I'm never going to be heard. And they just sit there on their strings and they're not doing anything. Sometimes that's the way people's systems are. And so we want to help people be able to listen in a key way, to understand why a part might be banging the drum really loud. And what we find over and over again is that when we listen to a part without judgment, in which other parts are giving us some space to be able to do that, parts tend to start to fall back into a more calm and safe experience of themselves, which then gives us room to be able to go to even the other part that posed a part, to be able to understand that part's perspective as well. This is where the internal family systems comes from. Because if we're doing a family session and all the members of the family are just yelling over each other and kind of screaming at each other, no one's going to get heard, right? And so what we have to do is maybe ask a person if they're just willing to listen for a while another person has center stage, with the clear assurance that eventually another person will be listened to as well. That's what we're doing within internal family systems. And what we call that capacity for that deep listening, we merely call it self energy. We came up with that name. I didn't come up with that name, by the founder of the approach, who said when he started to kind of discover what this was like, people said, oh no, that's not a part of me. This is just my true self. This is what it feels like when I'm balanced and calm. And I don't feel this way very often. But what we believe is we just need a little bit of that listening energy to start to be able to help people start to heal. And the healing comes in that listening, like that wise conductor who's able to bring forth a part story about why it does as it does. And this is actually in some ways one of the radical claims of IFS. It is one I buy. You don't have to buy it if you don't want to. That's okay. I was a little skeptical at first when I understood the approach. What we say is that there are no inherently bad parts. There are parts that take on extreme roles. There are parts that can harm us and harm other people, that can perpetuate trauma. And if we listen deeper than the extremity of a part's behavior, we will find, and I do find this over and over again in working with my clients, that if we can help parts separate from the extremity of its behavior and listen to its good intention, we can help the part find its way back towards a balanced, whole, and peaceful way of being as part of an entire person's personality. So I'm always listening for what's a part's good intention, even, and we don't beat around the bush, even if the part is putting someone else in danger, or putting yourself very often in danger. We just kind of see what it's like to balance that between kind of the honest recognition that someone's here for therapy because parts are behaving very extremely. And we also want to know, what Patrick said, like, not so much what did you do wrong or what's wrong with you, but what happened to you? Because if we can open that door a little bit, people might find some of the extremities starting to fade away. So what I want to do in just the remainder of my time is just share with you a couple stories of what this looks like in action. And I want to be very clear, these are amalgams. These are none of my clients, okay? These are kind of broad representations. The only story you'll hear that is an actual story is my story, which I'll end with. So the first thing that we're looking for in this approach is curiosity. Some of you might be saying, I cannot, stand it that, I drank again last night, or I can't stand how depressed I am. We say people don't even have to like their parts. They just have enough curiosity to start asking the question, what's happening with this part of me? So a kind of overall fictional case study I want to give you is someone who would come to me to do some work around something that's really triggering them. And so I'm going to give you an example of someone who comes in with an exceedingly harsh critic, someone who actually has a very successful life in many ways, thriving in their career, but they find themselves in the workplace blowing up at other people, or most often at themselves. Very harsh critic, withering ways, talking about those, and language I'm not even going to repeat, but language that is very, very harsh. When we start to get curious about this harsh critic, rather than judging it, rather than wanting it to go away, rather than disproving it, because what that tends to do with extreme parts tends to make them hide for a little while and then bounce right back. Like if you remember that old kids game, Snakes in a Can, it's like a pressurized environment. And so what we want to do is help someone start to listen. And so in this situation, what we start to notice is that this harsh critic took on this role because of the traumatized environment in which this person grew up. And in this hypothetical, just putting a whole bunch of things together, this person grew up in a household in which the parental figures had untreated substance use and untreated mental health challenges. There was also a legacy of being an immigrant, or being a first generation born here, coming from a country in which there was some undisclosed violence and trauma that the person never really knew, but it was just kind of always hovering over there at the kind of the edges of their awareness. And so as we started to listen to this harsh critic, it started to tell its story. And it actually didn't want to beat up on this person. What it was doing, and literally, this is the kind of thing, not verbatim here, but literally in a general way, this is the kind of thing we'll hear. A part will say, and we really attune to it, I took on this role, even though I don't want to do it, because the criticism that this person got from their family was so harsh that was easier when I hurt them rather than when they were hurt by withering criticism by someone else. With that, what happens is this starts to kind of move out here. And we can start to help the client or the person understand that they were actually doing this to protect. There was a good intention, even if it also came with harsh criticism, which sometimes the criticism became so harsh, the person would start drinking over this to try to make the criticism go away for a while. And that's the thing. It would work for a night until the hangovers, or until person's spouse the next day kind of recites to them all the harm that they had caused to that person. So we want to help get to the good intention at the core. And in time, what a person like this might do is recognize that as that harsh critic grows a little bit more quieter, and as the person recognizes it was just doing this to protect them, they're actually able to then get in touch with a part that was holding deep pain. A story that so many clients present with, and so many of us might feel, I know I have felt it in my own life as well too, there's something wrong with me. A phrase, we hear this all the time, I'm not good enough. When the protector, even a harsh critic, is able to be understood, it kind of unblends and steps back. And then we can help a person go to and witness this part, which is the part that holds the pain, the part that holds the story of where it learned, quote unquote, I'm not good enough, this belief. And what we do is we help someone literally, we call it unburdening, release that belief. We help someone release that constraint that they grew up with. And we help that younger part, and very often it is a younger part, could be 4 or 5, 6 years old, to be understood. This is the part that can sound of the work that sounds a little bit like inner child work, and it is. We're befriending in a compassionate way parts of us that have been exiled by the rest of our system in the name of protection, but have been carrying these deep wounds. And if we can help the person from that place of self, curiosity, compassion, courage, be able to go to that part. I mean, I did just one of these unburdenings with a client today. It's profoundly moving work. What we find then is the protectors don't need to kind of latch themselves to, let me protect to keep the part out of sight. Because when it was hurt, I was the best thing this person had protect, because there wasn't safety anywhere else. Where even if this harsh critic really could be mean to the person, it started to get its job because it wanted to help. Once we can go to the part that holds the wound, we can help other parts start to find the job that they want to do. A lot of what we're doing in this work is we're helping people listen in such a way, and in a brief way, we call this validation without identification. We can validate a part story without immediately agreeing with it or having another part push it away. By validating, we can say that, yeah, the things you did to deal with the trauma, to deal with the loss, to deal with the grief make sense. And what if we could open up other ways for you to do the job of being a protector, rather than, like in this kind of fictional case I'm sharing with you, taking on this role of the harsh critic. One of the ways that I like to express this, I'm going to share a quote. And this goes back before we had modern neuroscience. And the truth is, this part stuff, I get it. When I first heard about it, it sounds very woo. All right. Let's just accept that right off the bat. And the founder, and also the founder's kind of right-hand person, they've been on the staff and as faculty of Harvard Medical School. When we talk about these different parts of our personality, they also kind of graph very nicely onto different parts of our brains that get active when we're feeling safe, when we're feeling calm, or when we're feeling threatened or unsafe. And so I love this kind of this quote I want to share with you from a writer named Rainer Maria Rilke, who wrote well before the advent of modern psychology, neuroscience. Freud was barely even a thing, you know. He said, using kind of myths, ancient myths, he said, perhaps all the dragons in our lives are princesses who are waiting to see us act just once with beauty and courage. Perhaps everything that frightens us is, in its deepest essence, something helpless that wants our love. I'm going to repeat that. Perhaps all the dragons in our lives are princesses, you know, like the gendered version, you can just say royalty, who are only waiting to see us act just once with beauty and courage. Perhaps everything that frightens us is in its deepest essence, something helpless that wants our love. It sounds almost trite, and yet it really does form the basis for this approach. It is, especially with trauma, Patrick alluded to this, sometimes the most difficult thing is to trust ourselves because we think we're not worthy or we're unlovable. And so helping people to be able to walk through a process of reclaiming their discarded or even hated parts, to be able to find a way of trusting through the mechanism of listening to reclaim the fullness of their lives. And what I witness over and over again is this then facilitates the process of whether it's making amends or apologizing and or setting boundaries with other family members. It is so much easier to do that, I have found, when, there is balance on the inside. You know, it's kind of, this is an inside game. And when there's balance here and understanding and love within, it makes it much easier to relearn what it's like to be able to connect in safe and secure ways with other people. And I'll just end with this because I don't want to push the time. You know, Kim mentioned I'm a person in long-term recovery. My substance use, my very problematic alcohol use, got its start when I saw my mom at age 47 with no expectation that she was ill, drop dead right in front of my eyes at our family's apartment in New York City on Thanksgiving Day of all times. The part that didn't know how to handle that just got hidden away. Alcohol, it allowed me to cry. It also can make me a right bastard to be around. A lot of my own healing, and here's the thing with all of us who do IFS professionally, we also practice it with ourselves because this is such an intuitive kind of model that unless we're aware of our own parts, it's going to be really hard to listen for what kind of part a client is expressing or the qualities of that self-energy, that courage, compassion. It's really hard to see in someone else if we're not kind of familiar with that within ourselves. And so a lot of my own journey has being able to, in making amends to others and in learning to forgive myself, that as the great clinician Gabor Mate said, to learn to ask not why the addiction, but why the pain. And that's what I find so often within this IFS approach to healing, is that we can find what gave parts these extreme roles, these protector parts. We can heal the pain. And in healing the pain, help these protectors to find jobs that they don't feel so trapped in and that cause chaos in their lives and in the lives of other people. So thank you for letting me share tonight.
Thank you so much, Ken. I'm so glad that you were able to be with us tonight. That was very interesting. I appreciate that. I love the Rilke. That I never heard that one before. That was great. Chris King is with us. Chris, I'm so grateful to you. You know, folks, we have people in recovery on our programs, a lot of people in recovery from a substance use disorder, but we also a lot of us consider ourselves as family members in recovery, in a different kind of recovery. And Chris is someone that she's a friend personally, and I just really am grateful that you're willing to be so vulnerable about a topic that can be, it's personal, and you're very kind and generous to share with us. So thanks for being here, Chris.
Well, thank you, Kim. Thanks for inviting me. Since I've been on this journey, I've realized that this is really the best thing that I can do for myself, is to give back, is to share what's going on with me. I have really dug in to truth and to sharing that truth. And it's done a world of good for me. So my name is Chris King. I'm a single mom. I have two great daughters, Maris, who's 37, and my daughter Alexis, who's 32. In Thanksgiving of 2015, so we're about 7.5 years ago, it came to light that Maris was really in crisis. My older daughter, Maris, who was then 30 at the time, she was dealing with severe substance use disorder, and openly told me that weekend that she had an opiate addiction. And I could not have been more blindsided. Some people might think, like, how did you not see any signs of difficulty, any signs of addiction? But, she left home when she was 18 to go to college, and she never lived with me again. So when we were in the same city or close by, we spent time together. We shared time, we shared holidays, we went out to dinner, we went to the movies. There were times that she didn't live close to me, and we talked on the phone all the time. I really had no inkling. I was blindsided by this. I was really confused. I didn't know much about addiction. I certainly didn't know anything about opiates. And then I got really, really scared. And I think what happened was, thank you so much for explaining and giving us a solid definition, both of you, Ken and Patrick, about trauma. I did not realize the trauma that was happening to me. I was so focused on trying to figure out what was going on with her, how I could help her, that things were happening to me that I just kind of accepted I really wasn't aware of. I didn't pay attention to them. I didn't try to do too much about them. I realized I wasn't sleeping. I wasn't eating. I was going to work. I was going through the motions, but I really wasn't at my job. I began to isolate from my friends. I wasn't talking about this with almost no one because I really, really didn't understand it. I was so afraid. And I feel like the first couple months, I almost was paralyzed. I spent a lot of time in tears. I spent a lot of time on the couch. I lived alone, and I kind of put on reruns as company, as background noise. So I had something that was happening that I didn't have to think about very deeply. I was truly in real crisis. And this was the beginning of trauma. This is what I realize now. Like a lot of you, during that time, I made a lot of mistakes with Maris. When you're a parent and your kid is suffering or your child is sick, you try and help them. And the help that she was asking for, I was readily doing. I was giving her money. I was very familiar with that red phone in CVS where you go to wire money through Western Union. I was paying for her cell phone. I was paying for her car insurance. I think that first year did her taxes for her and paid them because I felt like I was trying to stay ahead of this storm that I knew was coming, right? Like I was trying to stave off these financial things that were going to come and hurt her and be difficult for her. So I was running around doing all these things that I now know it was impossible to stop that storm. It was impossible. It was one that she was creating in her life. And there's no way that I could have fended that off. But that's what I was doing in the beginning. Finally, a very good friend of mine and a friend of Kim's, somebody who was part of the conversation, said to me, you have to start going to some meetings. You need to meet Kim Porter. You need to go to some family support meetings. And thank God I did that. Thank God she said that. She took me by the hand, literally, and brought me to my first meeting there, be a part of the conversation. And I cannot thank her enough for that. I do that still to this day, and that was about 7 years ago. That Thanksgiving weekend, when it came to light about Maris's substance use disorder, there was this big rush to action. You know, what are we going to do with her? Where are we going to put her? What's going to happen? And I didn't know anything about this. And rather than vetting some places, getting some understanding, getting some education, knowing what would be a good, solid thing to do, we kind of rushed her off to this rehab that was recommended by somebody. It was a 2-week inpatient program in Maryland. 2 weeks. I mean, when I look back at that now, you know, I think kind of what it was it was a place for her to go. She probably detoxed for the first week, met some counselors, went to some meetings, got her first taste of what, you know, that kind of rehab would be, but 2 weeks. But it was the counselor there who said to me, listen, as her mom, you need to start to go to Nar-Anon meetings. So I started to do that too. I was going to be a part of the conversation parent meetings. I was going to Nar-Anon meetings. I was reading everything I could get my hands on about addiction. I was watching movies. I went to many, many of Kim's presentations, be a part of the conversation presentations. I probably was involved 3 or 4 nights a week, trying to get an understanding of what this disease is, what was happening to Maris. What I wasn't doing was, I was not aware of what was happening to me. I wasn't so aware of what was happening with Alexis, Maris's younger sister. I was so focused on Maris. An event happened, I think, probably around March, where I publicly had a meltdown. I was in a co-op near my house that I went to every morning. And it was a tipping point for me. I just fell apart in that store. I was yelling at people. I started crying. I was that person. God, what is going on? You know, should I be afraid of her? Can I help her? Like, what's happening, right? And just so you know, the tipping point was that there was no blue cheese dressing on the salad bar. And that threw me into this like meltdown. So when I left there, I sat in the car and I thought, oh, what was that about? Who was that person? I don't even know her. I don't recognize her. And I resolved that day that I needed more help. So I started making phone calls that afternoon to find a recommended addiction therapist. I knew that I needed somebody to guide me on what was going on here, how to help me. First, I wanted to find somebody to help me help Maris, right? That was my main motivation. And then I realized that I needed help in my own life. I did not recognize myself. So I made a lot of phone calls because the person that I wanted, the person I knew I could trust, was going to be somebody that had come through this themselves. That was the person that I knew I could talk to and I could trust what they were going to say, because that person would know the experience that Maris was having, what it felt like to be her. So I found this great, wonderful therapist, Ryan, and I did every single thing he told me without question to the letter of the law. And he loved me because I was a pretty easy client, I would imagine. I didn't fight him on anything. I turned it over to him. And, you know, he helped me to back off on some of these behaviors that were really enabling Maris. They really weren't helping her in the end. They really weren't helping me. He helped me talk to her about how I had to take her off my cell phone plan. I had to stop paying for her car insurance. I had to stop paying for her Cobra. And boy, did I feel like, wow, these are some lousy things to do to my child. But what was going on just wasn't normal. And we were just digging a bigger and deeper hole together. Oftentimes, you know, when I would help her, when I would send her money, when I'd go to that red phone, and sometimes I'd buy her a hotel room, you know, I'd fix some problem that she was having. She'd call me on the phone in crisis, and I'd do these things. And the next morning, I did not feel good about that. I felt good in the moment to be able to say yes and think, okay, I'm fixing this. But I realized the next day that Nothing had changed. And I did not feel good about saying yes to her all the time. Part of the problem was Maris relocated to Florida in June of 2016. I didn't see her for 2 years. And that, as a mom, is heartbreaking. But she was so far away that every time the phone rang and I saw that it was her, I just wanted to pick it up and hear her voice. You know, I missed her so much. But what I realized was whenever I heard her voice, I caved. I did whatever it was she wanted. I gave her the money. I bought the hotel room. I fixed the problem. And I realized I have to stop doing that. So I made a really hard decision. And I decided that when these phone calls came, I was going to let them go to voicemail. As much as I wanted to hear her voice, as much as I wanted to connect with her, I had to let it go to voicemail. And I learned that when I found myself in a calmer space, I could listen to her message and I could respond instead of reacting. I could respond to what the request was. Was it reasonable? Was this going to be a good thing? Did this work for both of us? And boy, was that hard to do, but it served me well. And I think, I know in the long run, it served her well too. I took some notes here because boy, there's a lot of things that went on during the last 7 years. So about a year in for me, in what I call my recovery now, in learning about addiction, in doing the work, in doing the things that I was doing with my therapist, Ryan, in these parent groups, I realized one night I was sitting in group and I was surrounded by people whose kids were in recovery. Just happened to be that kind of night. And mine was not. And my child, Maris, was not in recovery. And I thought to myself, you know what? Why not me? Why not Maris? Why am I always going to that negative space of look at how awful it is? Why am I spinning scenarios of the awful things that are happening? I don't really know what's happening because Maris is 1,000 miles away. And I'm spending a lot of time in sadness, in grief, in worry. And I can just shift my thought pattern and say, hey, you know what? Maybe no news is good news. Maybe good things are happening there. And I literally learned how to do that. And it took practice. Sometimes I was able to do that for 5 minutes. Sometimes it was for an hour. Then I would be able to go out to dinner with friends. I could extend that to a day, to a week, and I could feel it happening. And I just developed the capacity to say, I'm going to think in a positive way. And this, I believe, is where the beginning of hope really, really came for me. Why not? Why not? Why can't I have hope? Many people are successful in this. Why am I staying in this hopeless kind of place, right? I don't recognize myself. I'm acting crazy. I just shifted the narrative in my head, and it really did work for me. Some of the things that were really difficult during this time, the fact that I wasn't being honest. I wasn't being honest with myself at first. When I began to be honest with myself, I realized I wasn't being honest with the people around me. I wasn't sharing what was happening with Maris. More importantly, I wasn't sharing what was happening with me. You know, there's a guy I worked with. We had known each other for about 15 years. And in this initial period, he said to me months and months later, he said, I was afraid to talk to you. I would see you in the hall and I didn't know what was going on with you, but I was afraid to come over and talk to you because I knew you weren't the person that I had known. And I feel terrible about that. You know, I don't have a poker face, so I was wearing my heart on my sleeve. But as I got better, I became more honest about my situation. You know, I realized that Maris's story was her story to tell, but I also had a story to tell. And I started to get better, you know, with honesty, with being vulnerable, and with surrounding myself with a community of people, such as the parent group, the people in Be a Part of the Conversation, the people in Naranon who did that. They shared their experience. They shared their strength. They shared their hope. And I listened with all my heart. And I became part of that. They took me in, and they gave me those things. They've shared those things with me, and I learned them. And I hold on to them dearly. I hold on to them dearly today. A couple other things I did during that time. Whenever I talked to Maris, I never liked that term detached with love, because there was no way I was going to detach from her. What I detached from was that chaos that was surrounding her life. I stopped picking up the phone. I stopped trying to fix everything. I stopped worrying about what her financial page was going to look like. I stopped worrying about her credit, because those things I realized were all going to be fixable when she was ready to fix them. And there's no way I was going to stop them from happening. So I let those go. I detached from her chaos, and I always said to her, I'm here for you when you are ready. I love you, and I'm here for you when you're ready. But I can't participate in this kind of craziness, right? I just didn't do it. So all through this time, I believe she did know that I loved her. And this is really when I started to love myself too. I started to love myself again. I didn't blame myself. I learned so much about what goes on in a family when you love somebody with substance use disorder. And I stayed hopeful, and I stayed true, and I stayed doing the work. Those things really carried me through. I used to print signs out, like 8x11 pieces of paper with good quotes, and I would change them every week at where I worked. I'd have it on my desk and something positive to look at. And one of my favorites was a quote by Deepak Chopra that said, "All great changes are preceded by chaos." And I thought, well, yeah, we're in the chaos. Boy, we are sure in the chaos. So this is preceding great change that I know is going to come. I talked about this with Ryan, my therapist, and I said, geez, we're waiting. When are the changes going to come? I think that was on a Wednesday. And Saturday afternoon, the phone rang, and the voice on the other end said, "You have a collect call from an inmate in Daytona County Jail." And I thought, oh, here it is. Here's that change. Not really the change I was waiting for, but change came. That was my first understanding that when Maris was incarcerated, and it was a misdemeanor charge. It was, I think, she needed $100 to bail her out. And I said, no, I can't do that. $100, right? I'd given her thousands of dollars previously, but I knew that wasn't the right thing to do. She cried on the phone, and she told me she promised she'd go to rehab and she would get better. But I just knew that wasn't the right thing to do. So I didn't do it. And that was really hard, but it was right. She was bailed out of jail by somebody else. We went forward. In March of 2018, Maris's partner died in Florida of an accidental fentanyl overdose. In May of that same year, my mom died of colon cancer. So there was a lot going on in all of our lives. But the resources I had, the things I had put in place, the things I was working on, my recovery, were the things that enabled me to get through. The week my mom died, Maris called me and said that she was taking herself to detox. And I thought, wow, what is this wonderful miracle that I don't have to worry about her this week? She is going to take herself to detox. And then I can pay attention to this other thing that's happening in my life. My mom has gone, and I need to say goodbye to her, and I need to focus on that, and I need to be there in that moment. So it was a gift that Maris went to detox that week. I think of that often. Timing is pretty incredible, and I don't think that there are coincidences anymore. Let's see. One of the other things I learned, this whole thing, and Kim told me this early on, and it took me a while to catch on, was learn to trust the process. I can't change outcomes of things. I can only change what my reaction to things are. And trusting the process became something that I really believed in and I really held on to. In June of 2018, a month after my mom dies, I get another call, and it is from an inmate in a county jail in Fort Myers. And it's Maris. And this time it's a lot more serious. The charges are serious. She's also still on probation from being incarcerated on the East Coast in Daytona. And I felt relief. I felt relief that she was in a place where she was going to be safer than she was living, using substances, using heroin every day. That incarceration became the greatest gift that she ever received. And she tells her story readily. She tells her story often. And she says, it was the greatest thing that ever could have happened to me. This is where recovery began for her. She was originally supposed to be incarcerated 30 days, and it moved to 60 days, to 90 days, to 4 months, to 5 months. But I could hear in her voice what was happening, and she was finding recovery. Luckily for her, not all jails are like this, not all county jails are like this, but H&I could come in there, hospitalization and institutional help, and women in AA came in to that county jail 3 or 4 times a week. And Maris said at first she didn't go to those meetings because she wanted to get sober. She went because she was really, really bored. She said county jail is wildly boring. But what happened was, she said, it was the first time I began to really hear the message. It was the beginning of her recovery. And it turns out that incarceration was the luckiest thing that could have happened for all of us, because it brought her back to who she is, to who she was, and to who she is today. I'm going to tell you, there's so many things that happened during that time. And, people in recovery are my favorite people. People like Maris, people with substance use disorder who are in recovery, families in recovery, people like us, people who are in family recovery. And it's because we've done the work, right? We've looked inside and we have been honest with ourselves. We've been vulnerable. We've been willing to share what's going on. We've been willing to ask for the help that we need. And it's just a beautiful thing. I'm going to conclude with a couple of things about where we are now. Maris and her sister Alexis are forging this wonderful relationship, this wonderful, true friendship, more so than I've ever seen happen. They were 5 years apart. So growing up, they had different interests and, didn't like hang out a whole lot together. But what's happening now is the most beautiful thing, right? And as a mom, this is what you really, really want your kids to genuinely like each other, to genuinely enjoy spending time together. And I realized I couldn't control that. I couldn't make it happen, but they are doing it on their own, right? And it is true joy for me. All 3 of us have individual therapists that we each see as needed on a regular basis. We all continue that today, and it's great. We all really get a lot out of that. And Maris will celebrate 5 years of sobriety in July of this year. She has asked me to come and be in the room with her then, and to give her her 5-year coin. We have been on this journey together. And so it just feels wholly wonderful and appropriate. I'm so proud of her. I'm so happy for her. And I'm so honored that she's asked me to be part of this with her. And the other thing this is really what I want to say, we can all recover. Ask for the help that you need. Do not stay in this alone. It is possible for each and every one of us to recover from this, from substance abuse that many of our kids go through, or the trauma that we've experienced as a family of somebody that loves one with substance use disorder. Please reach out, ask for the help. I'm thankful to be part of this community. And I thank all of you for sharing your time with me tonight.
Chris, you're the best. Thank you so much. That was beautiful.
So if it's comfortable and safe for you to close your eyes to begin to connect with your experience in this moment, I'm going to invite you to do that. And if that doesn't feel comfortable or safe for any reason, that is totally fine. I would just ask you to kind of bring your eyesight to a point in front of you where eyes can just rest. And one of the kind of guiding principles in the work that I do is recognizing our triggers are our trailheads. If you know what hiking is, a trailhead is where a trail begins. And so, we want to see if we can be curious about anything. It may not be that it triggered us tonight, although maybe something did. It might be that something just left you very curious or wanting to know more, or that there is an unanswered question, an itch that needs scratching. It might be that you notice you're just very tired right now at the end of a long day. And so just see if you can create some space for whatever is here within you to be here. One of the ways to very naturally invite our bodies and our minds to do this is by recognizing that we're breathing. Just first noticing how your breathing is. It might be fast, it might be slow, it might be shallow, it might be deep, it might be smooth, it might be a little bit ragged. And once you notice how your breath is, just see if you can invite your breath to find kind of stable rhythm of breathing. In breath, giving your body what it needs, taking in the oxygen. And then the breath out, allowing yourself to release and maybe feeling yourself settle back into the chair or whatever it is that you're seated on that can support your body. And from this place of this mindful breath, again, just seeing if you can welcome whatever your experience is. Doesn't even mean you have to like your experience right now. It might just mean acknowledging it. I'm noticing there's some tiredness. I'm noticing there's some frustration. I'm noticing there's some clarity. I'm noticing there's some peacefulness. Noticing what it is like to speak to yourself as the kindest friend you can imagine would speak to you. To greet yourself and offer hospitality for whatever is here to be here. And noticing whatever is going on inside, beginning to shift the focus of your attention to what's happening around you. This could be noticing the sensations of what it is like for your body to receive the support of whatever it is you are seated upon. This could be just noticing the flow of your breath coming in and releasing from your body, the temperature of the air on your skin, the sounds of the voice speaking and the spaces of silence in between the words. Noticing whatever else you are receiving as sounds, some loud, some subtle. Noticing if your eyes are closed, that even on the backs of your eyelids, there's light and shadow, colors, patterns. Noticing what it is like to invite yourself to be where you are as you are with whatever is happening right now in this moment. And as we conclude this little time of mindfulness and checking in with ourselves and checking in with our environment around us, just maybe a little reminder as I close that the breath is always here. Our senses and sensations are always here. And that maybe they offer us a little beacon, not for a time when we get past the uncertainty or we have all the vital, really important questions answered, but right there, smack dab in the middle of everything that still is in motion. We might trust our senses, our breath, our awareness of this moment to just guide us home to right here, to finding a little bit of stability, a little bit of safeness. It can be as sometimes easy as just noticing the flow of the breath. And just setting that intention to check in with yourself as an act of kindness and compassion and love. And may it be so for all of us.